So I was actually trying to film this video yesterday, but unfortunately, wonderfully coordinated man that I am, I accidentally broke a glass and cut up a finger and a thumb. So as terribly embarrassing as that was, I still knew in my heart of hearts that I was having a much better day than Mike Johnson was. If you haven't heard, Mike Johnson was recently re-elected to the role of Speaker of the House, but it was not something that went entirely smooth. There were certainly some bumps in the road, mainly caused by a couple of Republicans that were outright threatening to blow up the whole process. You might remember a couple of weeks ago there was a very messy public fight amongst Republicans, including Musk and including Trump, about what the budget should actually look like going ahead and how close things came to a full-on government shutdown. A bipartisan budget proposal negotiated between Democrats and Republicans was blown up by Elon Musk diving into the fray and saying that it was unacceptable. And then you had Trump coming in and proposing that there be no limit on the debt ceiling until the end of his term, so a new budget was negotiated. But then that was sabotaged by a number of Republicans who detested the idea of basically unlimited government spending during Trump's term. So eventually a compromise budget did finally show up. A third proposal, which was reined back in spending, but notably did not give Trump his blank check that he wanted to spend as much money as he saw fit during his term in office. Johnson seemed to make enemies of just about everybody during that process. First of all, Democrats who basically negotiated a deal in good faith that Johnson then had to give up because Elon Musk didn't want it. And then, of course, fiscally conservative Republicans who are disgusted by the idea that Mike Johnson even proposed removing the debt ceiling. And then finally, even in the end there with that compromise, it did seem like some people were opposed to Johnson's maneuvering there because it wasn't pro-Trump enough. Everyone seemed to be upset by how he handled the situation. Look, I've made a whole video on that incident, so if you want to go back and watch that, feel free to for more details. But the point is that heading into his re-election campaign, Mike Johnson was on very thin ice with a lot of Republicans. So it was the opinion of many people, and myself included, that unless Trump got directly involved in this leadership race and wrangled Republicans himself, that Johnson probably wasn't going to get re-elected. He did in the end, but it was a very messy day to get him back the speaker's gavel. The first thing that I have to point out is that the Republican majority is minuscule. I mean, like, historically so. In a chamber where you need 218 members to have a functioning majority, the Republican Party got 220 in the last House elections in November. And since Matt Gaetz resigned for his failed Attorney General bid, the Republican Party only has 219 members, meaning if two people go against the party, two Republicans that is, then they don't have a practical functioning majority. So, on the day of the vote, what was the first piece of drama? Well, as the votes were being counted, 6 Republicans outright just refused to vote at all and voted present, meaning that they weren't going to be tallied there. And then you had 3 Republicans vote for other members of the Republican caucus. So in total, there are 9 people rebelling against Mike Johnson. So it's not looking good as the count is coming in. So Johnson is holding his breath, and we get to the end of voting, and he does not have the votes needed to be elected House Speaker. But fortunately for him, those 6 that didn't vote at all were asked by the clerk, just clarifying you're not voting at all, and they did eventually vote for Johnson. So that was just a bit of performative activism by Republicans, adding drama to a situation which already had more than enough. But still, those 6 coming around were not enough for Johnson to have a majority. Those 3 that voted against him outright were still holding out until Daddy Trump came in to save the day for Mike Johnson. Like any kid who's been bullied by their siblings, Mike Johnson picked up the phone and called the father of the Republican Party, that is Donald Trump, and begged for his help. And he got it. So whether it was through threats, bribery, or just a stern talking to, 2 of those 3 Republicans did get in line and voted for Johnson, making Johnson the speaker. But with the absolute bare minimum of votes needed to get him there. 218 required, and he got exactly 218, and he was re-elected as speaker. I think all of this is quite funny because Mike Johnson has pretty much always been what he is since coming into the limelight and becoming Speaker. And that is, he is a compromise candidate that is always walking on thin ice. Mike Johnson became Speaker of the House because factions of the Republican Party were tearing themselves apart over Kevin McCarthy, and he was just deemed unacceptable. So he was gone, and Mike Johnson was that politician that came in who very delicately balanced the scales in terms of being acceptable enough to the far right of the party, but also not completely insane for what few moderates remain to somehow balance that position and hold on to power. And honestly, the situation only seems worse for him now. Not only is the Republican majority even smaller, so as few as 2 Republicans outright opposing him could mean that he is removed as Speaker, but now he has to carefully toe that line, an even more fragile one than before, between people who are more economically minded and want, first and foremost, for the debt to be under control, and President Trump himself. The Freedom Caucus, for example, a grouping of Republicans in the House, which is one of the biggest critics of Johnson, has made clear in the aftermath of his election that their support for him is pretty contingent on him keeping the deficit under control and getting the federal debt down. That is very, very hard to do when Johnson's other loyalty, the personal loyalty that he now owes to Trump for literally saving his job, is probably going to be dependent upon the fact that Johnson does whatever Trump tells him to do, which will probably include, let's be honest, some very expensive projects and things that Trump wants to do, which could do some damage to balancing the books, which is what the Freedom Caucus wants. I think one big takeaway from this is the fact that Mike Johnson is not a leader. Mike Johnson does not have people there that are personally loyal to him. He is just the byproduct of an uncomfortable middle between 2 factions of the Republican Party that can't effectively govern themselves, let alone the country. And I think that's part of the uncomfortable reality for Johnson, propped up by Trump and an uneasy alliance between members of the Republican Party, is that a leader, if you want to call him that, who is backed up by nobody and who stands for nothing, at the end of the day is going to be respected by nobody.